The first frost of September had already silvered the grass along Sweetwater Creek, when Inez Rourke found the surveyor's stakes driven into her father's trapping ground. And she knew, before she read the paper nailed to the cottonwood, that something had come to steal the only thing she had left in the world. The valley lay cupped between two long shoulders of the Bitterroot foothills, a green seam of grass and timber threaded by the creek that gave the place its name. And in the autumn of 1878, it held perhaps 60 families who had come west for the same reason her father had once come. Because the land asked nothing of a person's past, only what they could put into the ground and pull back out again. Inez had been born in that valley 21 years before, the daughter of Liam Rourke, an Irish trapper who had followed the beaver trade up from the Missouri River country, and a French-Canadian woman named Yvonne who had died of a lung fever when Inez was 7. Since then it had been just the two of them, Liam and his daughter, in a low cabin built into the shoulder of the mountain, where the creek was born from a cold spring nobody else had ever bothered to find. He had taught her to read sign in the mud, to skin a marten without spoiling the pelt, to find her way through timber so thick a man could lose the sun by noon. He had died the winter before, gone through the ice on a beaver pond not 2 miles from the cabin, and Inez had buried him herself because there had been no one else close enough to help, and she had gone on trapping alone because it was the only life she knew. She pulled the notice from the tree and read it twice before the words settled into meaning. It was a public notice from the Territorial Land Office in Helena, posted by order of a man named Silas Crane, declaring his intention to file for the water rights of Sweetwater Creek from its headwaters, under the doctrine that whoever filed first upon a stream held the first and best claim to its water forever after. Inez had heard enough talk in town to know what that meant. Crane ran cattle by the thousands on the plateau above the valley, and dry years had made him hungry for water he did not have. If he claimed the creek at its source, he could dam it, or simply drink it dry with his herds, and every rancher and farmer and orphan trapper's daughter below him would be left with mud and stones where a living creek had run. She folded the paper into her coat and rode her father's old mule down out of the timber toward the town at the mouth of the valley, a huddle of clapboard buildings that called itself Sweetwater Crossing, though it was hardly big enough to deserve 2 names. The general store was crowded when she arrived, which was itself unusual, for Sweetwater Crossing rarely saw more than a handful of people at market day. Men stood in knots along the boardwalk, their hats pushed back, voices low and worried, and Inez recognized in their faces the particular fear of people who have put everything they own into land that might, by some stroke of a distant pen, cease to be worth anything at all. She tied the mule at the rail and went inside, where Mrs. Abigail Whitfield, the storekeeper's wife, was doling out coffee to a room full of men who had clearly been arguing for the better part of an hour. "Inez Rourke, Mrs. Whitfield said, catching sight of her, and there was real relief in her voice, for she was one of the few in town who had never looked twice at a girl who lived alone in the mountains and smelled of wood smoke and cured hides. "You have heard, then, about the water. I found the notice myself on my own land," Inez said. "Crane means to take the creek at the spring. That is my doorstep, Mrs. Whitfield, as much as it is anybody's in this valley." "It is everybody's," said a voice from across the room, and Inez turned to find a man she did not know well, though she had seen him before at the Mercantile and once at her father's burial, standing at the back with his hat in his hands out of respect for a man he had barely met. He was perhaps 27 years old, broad through the shoulder in the way of a man who worked cattle and not merely owned them, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. His name, she recalled, was Hugh Brooks, and he ran a modest spread of his own a few miles up the valley, one of the better-liked men in Sweetwater Crossing, though not, until that day, a man Inez had ever had reason to speak with. "The Territorial Land Office in Helena will honor whoever files first," Hugh Brooks said, addressing the room but his eyes flicking once briefly to Inez, as though including her in the accounting without quite meaning to. "Crane has already sent a rider." If we do not send one faster, this valley will belong to him in everything but name within the year." "Helena is 6 days by the wagon road," said old man Tolliver, who ran the blacksmith shop. "6 days there, and Crane's man left 2 mornings past. We cannot beat him on that road." "Then we do not take that road," Hugh said, though there was little confidence in it. Only the stubbornness of a man refusing to say a thing was impossible before he had tried it. It was into that silence, into that room full of frightened, decent people who did not know that the answer to their trouble was standing among them in a canvas coat that smelled of pine pitch and beaver musk, that Inez Rourke spoke. "There is a way through the bitter root that cuts 2 days off the wagon road," she said. "My father found it trapping marten 15 years back. It is steep and it is narrow and no wagon could ever pass it, but a man on a good horse, riding light, could make Helena in 4 days instead of 6. Every face in the room turned toward her. She felt the weight of their looking, the particular attention of people who had spent a year and more regarding her as something between a curiosity and an embarrassment, the wild girl who lived up in the rocks and spoke to nobody but her mule. She lifted her chin and did not look away from any of them. "You know this trail," Hugh Brooks said. "It was not quite a question. I have walked it 100 times. I could walk it blind." She paused, and because she had learned from her father that a person with something valuable ought never give it away for nothing, she added, "But I will not draw you a map and send you off with it, Mr. Brooks. If this valley is worth saving, it is worth paying a fair price for the saving of it." A murmur went through the room, some of it approving, some of it scandalized that an orphaned girl of 21 should dare to bargain with grown men over the fate of the valley. Hugh Brooks, however, did not look scandalized. He looked, if anything, faintly amused, and beneath the amusement something more serious, a man taking her measure and finding more there than he had expected. "What price," he said, "would you ask?" "2 things," Inez said. "First, that this valley's ranchers and farmers, once the creek is secured, put their names to a fair witness of my father's claim on the land where our cabin stands, so that no one, not Crane nor any man after him, can ever again nail a notice to my tree and call my home his to sell. I have lived on that ground since I was 6 years old. I mean to die there, God willing, a good many years from now, and I will not have it taken from me because I am a woman alone with no husband to speak for my claim." Under the Homestead Act, an unmarried woman past the age of 21 could file her own claim as well as any man, and Inez had heard her father say so more than once, though he had never gotten around to filing formally himself, trusting instead in distance and the general disinterest of the territorial government in a single trapper's cabin. It was a right she meant to use now, and to see recognized beyond any argument. "And the second," Hugh Brooks said. "The second is that I go with whoever rides for Helena. I am the only one who knows the trail well enough to bring a man through it alive in 4 days, instead of losing him to a canyon or a bad ford. I do not intend to hand over my father's secret, and then sit at home wondering if the man who took it got himself killed for want of knowing which fork to take at Elkhorn Creek." There was a longer silence after that, and Inez watched the room turn the notion over, watched the older men frown at the impropriety of it. A young unmarried woman riding 4 days alone into the mountains with a man not her husband, and watched Hugh Brooks watch her, weighing something in his own mind that she could not read. "I will not have you thinking less of yourself for saying what needed saying," he said at last, quietly, as if only to her, though the whole room heard it. "You have offered this valley its only chance. I would be a fool and worse than a fool to argue over what is proper when the alternative is watching Crane dry up every creek bed between here and the Yellowstone." "Then you accept the bargain," Inez said. "I accept it," Hugh Brooks said, "and I will be the one riding if the town will have me, and I will be glad of your company on the trail, Miss Rourke, and grateful besides." It was decided within the hour, in the manner of small towns facing a common danger, with the town council, such as it was, 3 farmers and the blacksmith and the storekeeper, putting their names to a paper promising to witness and defend Inez Rourke's claim to her father's land, once the business of the water rights was settled. Mrs. Whitfield cried a little and hugged Inez, which startled her, for she was not much used to being embraced by anyone since her mother died. And by the time the sun had dropped behind the western ridge, Inez Rourke found herself standing at the corral behind the livery, checking the cinch on a borrowed gray gelding, preparing to ride into the mountains with a man she had spoken to exactly twice in her life, carrying between them the whole future of a valley that had never quite decided whether it wanted her in it. They left before first light the next morning, riding north and then west along the wagon road only as far as the forks, where Inez turned her gelding off the beaten track and into a stand of lodgepole pine so thick that Hugh Brooks, following, had to duck low over his saddle to keep from losing his hat to the branches. "You are certain this is a trail and not merely the absence of one," he said, after they had gone perhaps a mile in silence broken only by the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on pine duff. "My father called it the Martin Trail," Inez said, not turning around. "The Kootenai people used it long before he ever set a trap in these mountains, and no doubt they had a better name for it than his. It follows the ridge above Elkhorn Creek, drops down through a notch my father called the Devil's Stair, and comes out above the Helena Road, a full day's ride closer than the wagon route ever gets. It is not an easy way, Mr. Brooks. There are places where a horse must be led rather than ridden, and one stretch along the stair where a man afraid of heights would do well to keep his eyes on his own boots." "I am not afraid of heights," Hugh Brooks said, in the tone of a man who was perhaps a little afraid of heights, but unwilling to admit it to a woman he had known for one day. She glanced back at him then, the first real look she had allowed herself since they left the corral, and found him watching the timber around them with the careful, assessing eye of a man who had spent time somewhere dangerous before this. It occurred to her that she knew almost nothing about him beyond his name and his cattle, and the fact that the town trusted him enough to send him alone into the mountains with their future in his saddlebags. "You rode with the cavalry," she said. It was not quite a guess. Something in the way he sat his horse, the way his eyes swept the tree line as though counting exits, told her so. "Fourth Cavalry, out of Texas until '74, he said. "I scouted for a time after that, before I decided I had seen enough of Apache country and Comanche country both to last a man 3 lifetimes, and came north instead to raise cattle where the worst danger was a bad winter." He paused. "I did not expect to find myself riding a secret trail through the Bitterroot with the daughter of a trapper I never had the chance to know well, chasing a land office deed before a rich man's rider could beat us to it. Life has a way of surprising a man." "My father would have liked you," Inez said, surprising herself with the warmth in it. He did not care for much in the way of manners, but he respected a man who had seen hard things and come out the other side without turning mean. "Is that what you see in me? A man who has not turned mean?" "I have not decided yet," Inez said, and thought she heard him laugh, low and startled, behind her. They climbed steadily through the morning, the timber thinning as the trail rose, until by midday they came out onto a bare shoulder of rock where the whole valley spread below them, the creek a bright thread stitching green fields together, the town no more than a scatter of gray roofs at the valley's mouth. Inez stopped her horse there, as she always did when she came this way, and looked down at the only home she had ever known. "It does not look like much from up here," she said. "Just a crease in the mountains. But every family down there put something into that ground. Sweat mostly, and some of them their whole lives' savings, and Crane thinks he can dry it up because he has more cattle and more money than the rest of us put together." "He is wrong," Hugh Brooks said, drawing his horse up beside hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of the animal's flank against her leg. "Money is not the same as right, whatever men like Crane would have the rest of us believe. We are going to beat his rider to Helena, Miss Rourke, and we are going to file that claim, and this valley is going to keep its water because a trapper's daughter knew a trail nobody else remembered." She did not answer him at once, because something in the plainness of his conviction, The way he said it as a simple fact rather than a hope had caught somewhere in her chest and lodged there, warm and unfamiliar. "You may call me Inez," she said finally. "If we are to spend 4 days on a trail together, Miss Rourke seems a great deal of formality." "Inez," he said, trying the name as though testing its weight, and something in the way he said it, careful and pleased at once, told her he liked the sound of it. "Then you had better call me Hugh." They rode on through the afternoon, dropping again into timber, following a game trail along the shoulder of Elkhorn Creek, where the water ran loud and cold over granite boulders the size of wagons, and Inez found herself, without quite meaning to, telling him things she had not spoken aloud to anyone since her father died. She told him about the winter her mother took sick, about the smell of the cabin during those last weeks, camphor and wood smoke, and the particular quiet of a house waiting for grief. She told him about her father's hands, thick and scarred from 30 years of trap lines, and how gentle they had been despite it, how he had taught her to set a snare so soft a rabbit would not feel the wire until it was already caught. She told him about the morning she found him gone through the ice, and how she had walked 6 miles back to the cabin alone in the cold before she let herself cry. Hugh listened without interrupting, in the way of a man who had learned somewhere, perhaps in the cavalry, perhaps after it, that grief wanted witnessing more than it wanted advice. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he told her in turn about his own losses. A younger brother killed at Adobe Walls in a fight that had nothing to do with either of them. A father who had drunk himself into an early grave after the war took the family's Georgia land. A woman named Charlotte he had been engaged to marry before the cavalry sent him to Texas, who had married another man rather than wait 3 years for his return. "I do not blame her for it," he said. 3 years is a long time to ask a person to wait on a promise. But it taught me something about holding things too loosely or too tightly. I have never quite decided which. I came to Montana Territory to build something that could not be taken from me the way the war took my father's land, or the way 3 years of silence took Charlotte. I built my ranch with my own hands, every board of it, and I do not intend to let a man like Crane come along now and prove to me that none of it was ever as solid as I believed. "It is solid," Inez said. "You only need to prove it to Crane, not to yourself." He looked at her, then with an expression she could not name, something between surprise and gratitude, and said nothing more. But she felt the silence between them settle into something easier, something that had not existed between them that morning. They made camp that first night in a hollow below a granite outcrop, sheltered from the wind, and Inez set about building a fire with the quick, economical movements of a person who had done it 1,000 times before, while Hugh unsaddled the horses and picketed them where they could graze on the last of the summer grass. When the fire caught, they sat close to it, sharing the biscuits and dried venison Mrs. Whitfield had packed for them, and the cold mountain dark settled around them, thick with stars. "Tell me about your mother," Hugh said. "You have told me a great deal about your father but very little about her." "She was from a settlement on the Saskatchewan," Inez said. "French-Canadian, though she had Cree blood in her as well, on her own mother's side, which she did not speak of often because there were people even then who thought less of a person for it, though I never understood why a person's blood should matter more than their character. She met my father when his trapping brought him north one summer, and she came south with him against her own family's wishes, and I think she was happier here than she let on to anyone but me, though she missed the sound of French being spoken, and the particular way the northern lights showed over the plains up there. She taught me songs in French before she taught me anything in English. I still sing them sometimes when I am alone in the cabin and the wind is bad." "Sing one now," Hugh said. "You would not understand the words. I do not need to understand them to want to hear them." She hesitated, feeling foolish, but something in his face, lit orange by the firelight, patient and unhurried, decided her, and she sang low a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child, about a little boat on a river and a mother waiting on the shore. Her voice was not trained, but it was true, and when she finished, Hugh was quiet for a long time, watching her across the fire. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you have become," he said finally. "Alone in those mountains, keeping her memory and your father's both alive, and brave enough besides to bargain with a room full of frightened men for what is rightfully yours. I do not think I have met anyone quite like you, Inez Rourke." She felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the fire, and looked away toward the dark shapes of the horses grazing at the edge of the firelight. "You have known me one day, Hugh Brooks. Do not go making grand pronouncements about a person you have known one day." "A day can tell a man a great deal," he said, "if he is paying attention." And though she did not answer him, she found she was smiling into the dark long after he had gone quiet and rolled into his blanket for the night, and she lay awake some while longer than she should have, listening to the fire settle and the creek run somewhere below them, thinking about the particular way he had said her name. They woke before dawn to a sky gone the color of a bruise, heavy clouds pressing down over the peaks to the west, and Inez felt her stomach drop at the sight of it. "Snow," she said, saddling her horse quickly. "Early for it, but the mountains do not care what the calendar says. If it catches us on the Devil's Stair, we will lose half a day at best, and at worst we will lose a horse or ourselves." "Then we had better move," Hugh said, and they did, pushing the horses harder than Inez liked on a trail with this many roots and stones, but the sky gave them no choice. By mid-morning the first flakes had begun to fall, thin and dry, more warning than storm, and by the time they reached the notch in the ridge that her father had named the Devil's Stair, a switchback trail no wider than a wagon wheel clinging to the face of a granite cliff, the snow had thickened into something that stung the eyes and blurred the trail ahead into gray. "We walk from here," Inez said, dismounting and taking her gelding's bridle close to the bit. "Lead your horse, do not ride him, and keep your eyes on the trail, not on the drop. If he startles, let go of the rein rather than fight him. A horse can often save itself if a man does not get himself killed trying to save the horse first." Hugh did as she said without argument, though she could see, even through the snow, the tightness around his eyes that told her the height troubled him more than he had admitted the day before. She kept talking as they went, not because there was anything more to say about the trail, but because she sensed he needed the sound of a voice to anchor him against the long gray drop to his left. And so she told him about the time her father had led a pack train of furs down this very stair in a spring thaw, and how the leaders of the pack had refused to move until he sang to them, an old French trapper's song he had picked up from her mother. And how from that day forward every animal in the string had come to expect a song before it would take the stair. "Are you offering to sing to my horse?" Hugh said, and she could hear, even through his tension, that he was trying to smile. "If it comes to it, I will sing to yours and mine both," she said, and true enough, when her gelding balked at a patch of ice near the narrowest point, she sang, the same lullaby from the night before, soft and steady, and the animal's ears came forward listening, and it stepped past the ice as though the song itself had smoothed the way. Hugh watched this with something like wonder and said nothing, but she saw him mouth a few words of the tune himself as his own horse, encouraged by the sound, followed hers safely across. They came down off the stair by early afternoon, snow still falling but lighter now, into a stand of spruce that offered some shelter from the wind, and there, rounding a bend in the trail, they very nearly rode into 3 men on horseback who had clearly been waiting, poorly hidden in the trees. Inez recognized none of them, but she recognized the type at once, hard-faced men in good coats too fine for honest cowhands, and she saw Hugh's hand drop to the pistol at his hip even as he kept his voice mild. "You are a long way from any road," Hugh said. "So are you," said the foremost of the 3, a lean man with a scar through one eyebrow. "Funny thing, meeting you out here, Brooks, when word in Helena has it Sela's Crane's man rode out of the wagon road 2 days back and should be near the land office himself by now. You would not be trying some shortcut, would you? Trying to beat a fair race with a cheat's trail?" There is no rule against knowing the country better than the next man, Hugh said. Mr. Crane thought you might feel that way, the scarred man said, and Inez saw now that all three of them had their hands resting easy near their own weapons, and felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs. He asked us to see that you did not trouble yourselves making the trip. Kinder to turn back now, before the weather gets worse, and no one need get hurt over a piece of paper. We are not turning back, Inez said, before Hugh could answer, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her own voice. This is my father's country you are standing in, and I know it a good deal better than any man Crane could hire out of a saloon in Helena. If you mean to stop us, you will have to do it in this snow, on this trail, where your horses do not know the ground and mine do, and I promise you that is a fight you will lose before it starts. The scarred man's eyes flicked to her, taking her in properly for the first time, the mule-eared boots and the canvas coat and the rifle slung across her saddle that she had not thought to hide, and something in his expression shifted, some calculation of risk against reward. Feisty for a trapper's girl, he said. Feisty enough to put a bullet through a marten's eye at 40 paces without spoiling the pelt, Inez said. Ask yourself whether you would like to test how well that skill transfers to a man standing considerably closer than 40 paces, in whether that will hide the shot from anyone who might come looking for you after. It was a bluff in part, for she had never in her life shot at a person, and hoped devoutly she would never have to begin now, but she said it with her father's own flat certainty, the voice he had used on men who tried to cheat him at the trading post, and she watched it land. The three riders exchanged a glance, and the scarred man, after a long moment, spat to one side and turned his horse. Crane will hear you got through, he said. That is all we are obliged to report. Whatever comes after is between you and the land office. They rode off through the trees, and Inez let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling now that there was no longer a need to hide it. You are shaking, Hugh said, moving his horse close to hers. So would you be if you had just threatened 3 armed men with a bluff about your shooting, Inez said, and he laughed, a real laugh, relief in it, and reached over to steady her hand where it gripped the saddle horn. That was the bravest thing I believe I have ever seen, he said. And I rode with the cavalry through country that would curl your hair, Inez. I mean that. I did not feel brave. I felt terrified. That is what brave is, Hugh said, when you look at it plainly. A person who is not afraid has nothing to be brave about. It is only those of us who are afraid and act anyway who earn the word. They rode on in the thinning snow, and something had changed between them in the space of that confrontation. A wire drawn taut and then, in the relief of survival, gone warm and close. That night, camped in a low stand of timber with the snow still sifting through the branches above them, Hugh built the fire larger than the night before, and when Inez sat close to it, teeth still not quite done chattering from the cold and the aftermath of fear, he put his arm around her shoulders without asking, and she let him, leaning into the solid warmth of him, and neither of them spoke for a long while. I have been alone a long time, Inez said eventually into the quiet. Since my mother died, if I am honest, though my father was there in body. He loved me, I do not doubt it, but he was not a man given to talking about feeling, and after my mother went, there was no one left in that cabin who wanted to talk about anything but trap lines and weather and the price of pelts at the trading post. I had almost forgotten what it was to have someone put an arm around me and mean something kind by it. You do not have to forget it any longer, Hugh said, quiet, his voice close to her ear. Not if you do not wish to. She turned her face up toward his, and in the firelight she could see him clearly, the careful, searching look in his eyes, a question he had not yet found words for, and she understood with a startling certainty that she did not want him to find other words, that she wanted this instead, and she closed the small distance between them and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, soft, tentative on both their parts, and when it ended they stared at each other for a long moment in the firelight, both a little stunned by their own boldness. I did not intend that, Inez said, though there was no regret in her voice. "I am glad of it regardless," Hugh said, and kissed her again, longer this time, his hand coming up to cradle her jaw, and the fire crackled and the snow fell soft outside the ring of its light. And for a while neither of them thought of Sela's crane or land offices or water rights at all, only of the warmth of another person after a long, cold season of being alone. They reached the outskirts of Helena on the evening of the fourth day, exhausted, saddle-sore, the horses lathered and blowing hard, but ahead of Crane's rider, who they learned from the hostler at the livery had only arrived that same afternoon and was resting his horse before presenting himself at the land office in the morning. "Then we have him," Hugh said, energy returning to his voice despite the exhaustion in his body. "The office opens at 8. If we are there at the door when it does, we file first, and Crane's man arrives to find the claim already registered." They spent the night at a modest boarding house near the Capitol grounds, and Inez, lying awake in a real bed for the first time in 4 days, found she could not sleep for the tangle of feeling in her chest, exhaustion and triumph and something else, something new and frightening and wonderful that she did not yet have a name for, though she suspected, lying there in the dark, that the name for it was love, and that she had fallen into it somewhere on a mountain trail with a man she had known for only 4 days, but felt already that she had known her whole life. The land office opened at 8 precisely, a squat brick building with a clerk behind a high wooden counter, who looked mildly surprised to see 2 travel-worn riders waiting on his step before he had even unlocked the door. Hugh presented the town's collective petition, drawn up and signed by the ranchers and farmers of Sweetwater Valley, requesting the water right to Sweetwater Creek from its headwaters under the doctrine of prior appropriation, to be held in common by the valley's irrigation ditch company for the equal benefit of all its members. Inez, in the same breath, presented her own claim to the cabin and the surrounding acreage her father had occupied for 15 years, her own signature upon it, witnessed by the town council of Sweetwater Crossing, a woman of 21 years filing in her own name for the land that was rightfully hers. The clerk, a patient man named Mr. Ordway, examined both documents with careful attention, stamped them, entered them into a heavy ledger bound in leather, and looked up at them with the faint, tired satisfaction of a man who had seen 100 such races before and always found them, in the end, more interesting than the ordinary business of his day. "Filed and recorded," he said, "as of 8:04 this morning, the 22nd of September, 1878. Sweetwater Valley Ditch Company holds first right to the waters of Sweetwater Creek from its source, and Miss Rourke here holds clear title to 160 acres including the cabin and spring at the headwaters, as described. I will note that a Mr. Crane's representative inquired after this same water right not 1 hour ago, and was informed the claim had already been filed. He did not seem a pleased man, if you will permit me the observation." Hugh let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire valley with it and turned to Inez, and though they stood in a public land office with the clerk watching and a line of mourning business already forming behind them, he took her hands in both of his and pressed his forehead briefly to hers. "We did it," he said. "You did it. This valley owes you everything, Inez Rourke, and I mean to spend a good deal more than 4 days telling you so." They rode out of Helena that same afternoon, lighter in spirit if not in body, retracing their steps not by the treacherous Devil's Stair, which Inez judged too dangerous now that the early snow had deepened, but by the longer wagon road, which gave them, if anything, more time together, more days of easy conversation and shared meals and nights beneath the same wide sky. And by the time they crested the last ridge above Sweetwater Valley and saw the town spread out below them, gold with the last of the aspen leaves, Inez knew with a settled certainty that whatever came next in her life, she wanted Hugh Brooks beside her for the whole of it. The valley's welcome when they rode in was more than either of them had expected. Word had traveled ahead of them somehow, as word in small towns always does, and half the population of Sweetwater Crossing was gathered at the edge of town, the toll of her children waving, Mrs. Whitfield already crying before Inez had even dismounted, an old man Tolliver himself, gruff as ever, shaking Hugh's hand so hard it seemed likely to come off at the wrist. "The water is ours," Hugh announced, to a cheer that startled the horses. "Filed and recorded in Helena 4 days past. Crane's man arrived an hour too late, and there is nothing now he can do about it, short of buying the whole territory outright, and I do not believe even his money runs that deep." There was celebration in the town that night. A bonfire and fiddle music and more goodwill directed at Inez Rourke than she had experienced in the whole of her life put together. But it did not last as simply as any of them might have wished. For Silas Crane himself rode into Sweetwater Crossing 3 days later, at the head of a half-dozen of his hired men, and the valley's celebration curdled quickly into a wary, watchful silence as he reined up before the general store, where much of the town had gathered. Crane was a tall man, silver-haired, dressed with a fastidiousness that seemed almost an insult in a town of homespun and canvas, and he surveyed the crowd with the particular contempt of a man who had never in his life doubted that money would eventually buy him whatever he wanted. "I understand there has been some legal trickery," he said, without preamble. "A claim filed by a trail no honest man would use, by a girl with no more right to 160 acres than my saddle horse. I have consulted with lawyers in Helena. Claims obtained through deception can be challenged, gentlemen, and I intend to challenge this one in every court this territory possesses, for as long as it takes, until either the water is mine or every one of you is bankrupted trying to keep it from me." There was fear in the crowd at that, real fear, for a legal challenge dragged out over years could ruin small farmers as surely as a diverted creek, and Inez felt her stomach drop at the thought of it. All their effort, all that dangerous ride through the mountains, undone by lawyers and paper in a courtroom none of them could afford to fight in. It was Hugh who stepped forward, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a hard edge Inez had not heard from him before. "There was no deception, Crane," he said. "A trail is not a trick merely because you did not know of it. And before you spend your lawyer's fees on a challenge, you might consider that half the men and women in this valley watched your hired riders threaten a young woman on that same mountain trail, with witnesses present, and I expect a territorial judge would take a dim view of a man who sends armed men to intimidate a claimant before turning to the courts when intimidation fails. I have already written to the United States Marshal in Helena describing the encounter, in some detail, along with the names your own men gave when I asked them, foolishly, as it turned out for them. You may fight this claim in court if you wish, Mr. Crane, but you will do it under the shadow of your own men's testimony about what they did on that mountain, and I do not think that shadow will serve you as well as you imagine." Crane's face, for the first time since he had ridden in, showed something other than contempt, a flicker of calculation, of a man recognizing that the ground beneath his feet was not as solid as he had believed. He looked around the crowd, at the set, unyielding faces of people who had banded together against him, at Inez Rourke standing straight back beside Hugh Brooks with her father's rifle still slung across her back out of old habit, and something in the tableau seemed at last to persuade him of the cost of continuing. "This valley is not worth the trouble you are all so determined to make of it," he said, with the particular grace of a man trying to salvage pride from a losing position. "There is other water, other grass." He turned his horse. "You may keep your creek and your girl and your foolish trail, Brooks. I will not waste further money proving what you have already made plain." He rode out with his men, and did not in fact return, for word came later that year that a federal marshal had indeed made inquiries into the conduct of his hired riders on the mountain trail. Inquiries that Crane, mindful of his standing in Helena society, was eager to see quietly settled rather than pursued into open scandal, and he turned his attention instead to grazing leases farther east, and Sweetwater Valley, and its creek, and its people were troubled by him no more. The town's celebration, once Crane's dust had settled on the road out of the valley, resumed with even greater warmth than before, and it was that same night, with the bonfire burning low and the fiddle player finally resting his aching wrist, that Hugh Brooks found Inez sitting a little apart from the crowd, watching the sparks rise into the dark, and sat down beside her without a word, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You are quiet," he said. "I am thinking," Inez said, "that I do not quite know what to do with myself now. I have spent my whole life either being my father's daughter or being alone. I have never had to think about what comes after saving a valley." "May I offer a suggestion," Hugh said, "as to what might come after?" "You may." He turned to face her, and even in the dim firelight she could see the seriousness in his expression, the same steady conviction she had come to know on the mountain trail, the voice of a man who did not say things he did not mean. "I have a ranch a few miles up the valley," he said. "It is not large, but it is solid, built with my own hands, the way I told you, so that nothing could ever take it from me the way the war took my father's land. I built it, if I am honest with myself, without knowing what I was building it for, only that I wanted something of my own that could not be lost. I understand now, having spent 4 days on a mountain with you and a great deal more time than that thinking about you since, exactly what I was building it for. Inez Rourke, I would be glad, more glad than I have words to properly say, if you would consider joining your 160 acres to my own, and joining your life to mine besides. I love you. I do not think I have loved anyone the way I love you, not even Charlotte, not in the years before this valley, and I would like very much to spend whatever years the Lord grants us finding out together what that means." Inez felt tears come, unexpected and warm, and did not try to stop them. "I have never had anyone offer me a whole life before," she said. "Only ever a season or a winter or a trail through the mountains. You are offering me the rest of it." "I am," Hugh said, "if you will have it." "I will have it," Inez said, and kissed him there beside the dying bonfire with half the valley close enough to see, and this time neither of them cared who watched. They were married the following spring, in May of 1879, on the ground where Hugh's ranch met the boundary of Inez's own 160 acres. The two properties joined that day not only by law, but by a wedding that the whole of Sweetwater Valley turned out to attend. Mrs. Whitfield had sewn the dress herself, white cotton with a collar of lace ordered specially from a catalog in St. Louis. An old man Tolliver had forged a pair of matching rings from silver. He traded a full season's worth of shoeing work to obtain. And the valley's minister, a circuit rider who passed through only twice a year, had timed his visit that spring specifically to perform the ceremony. Having heard the story of the trapper's daughter, and the water rites told and retold in every settlement along his route, Inez wore, tucked beneath the borrowed lace at her collar, a small locket that had belonged to her mother, the one thing of Yvonne she had kept through all the years since her death. And she thought, standing beneath the cottonwood trees with Hugh Brooks's hands in hers and the whole valley watching, that her mother and father both would have been glad to see her standing there, not alone any longer, not the wild girl from the mountain cabin that people spoke of in careful, pitying tones, but a woman with a home and a husband and a whole community who had come, in the space of one desperate autumn journey, to understand exactly what she was worth. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for no life in that country ever was. There was a summer of drought 2 years into their marriage that tested even the newly secured water rights, when the creek ran low enough that the ditch company had to ration turns at the headgates, and Inez, drawing on knowledge her father had taught her of the mountains above, led a small party up to the spring itself, and found a way to clear a choked channel that had been slowly starving the flow, restoring water enough to see the valley through to the autumn rains. There was a hard winter in 1881 when a blizzard trapped half the valley's cattle on the high range, and Hugh, with the same steady competence he had shown on the mountain trail, organized a rescue that saved most of the herd, though not without frostbite that cost him 2 fingers on his left hand, a loss Inez tended through weeks of careful nursing, and which he wore afterward, he liked to say, as a kind of medal, proof of a winter survived together. But there was more happiness than hardship, far more, in the life they built. Their first child, a son they named Liam after Inez's father, was born in the autumn of 1880, in the same cabin at the headwaters where Inez herself had been raised, for she had insisted on keeping the old place standing even after she and Hugh combined their properties into a single working ranch, wanting her children to know the cabin where their grandfather had lived and trapped and loved a woman from the north, whose songs still echoed sometimes through those rooms when Inez sang her children to sleep. A daughter followed 2 years after, whom they named Yvonne for Inez's mother, and after Yvonne came a second son, William, named for no one in particular except that Hugh had always liked the name, and the ranch house that had once sheltered only a lonely widower's ambitions grew loud and warm with the sound of children's feet on its floorboards. Inez never did give up trapping entirely, though she practiced it now more as a skill passed down than a necessity of survival, teaching her children, all 3 of them in their turn, to read sign in the mud along the creek, and to set a snare so gently a rabbit would not feel the wire until it was caught, exactly as her father had taught her. She taught them her mother's French songs as well, and the valley grew accustomed over the years to the sound of a woman's voice singing in a language most of them did not understand, drifting down from the ranch at the head of Sweetwater Creek on quiet evenings, and no one in the town thought it strange any longer, or spoke of Inez Rourke, now Inez Brooks, as a wild curiosity from the mountains, but rather as one of the valley's own most respected voices. A woman whose courage on a snowbound trail had secured water and land and future for every family within it. Hugh's ranch prospered as the valley itself prospered, for a community with secure water and no cattle barren looming over its future had every reason to grow, and by the mid-1880s Sweetwater Crossing had added a schoolhouse and a proper church, and a second general store to serve its expanding population, much of that expansion drawn by the valley's reputation, told and retold at trading posts and stage stops across the territory. As a place where the water could not be taken from a person by any rich man's scheme, a place, people said, that a trapper's orphaned daughter had saved with nothing but her father's old trail and her own considerable nerve. On the 10th anniversary of that journey through the mountains, in the autumn of 1888, Hugh and Inez rode together, without their children this time, back up along the old Martin Trail as far as the overlook where they had first stopped on that first cold morning, the same bare shoulder of granite where the whole valley had spread below them, green and gold with the turning aspens, the creek still running bright and full through fields that had grown wider and richer with every passing year. 10 years, Inez said, looking down at the valley she had grown up in, saved, and never once regretted. It does not seem possible. It does not, Hugh agreed, drawing his horse close beside hers as he had done that very first day, though I remember it as clearly as if it happened last week. A frightened young woman standing up in a room full of men twice her age, telling them all she knew away through the mountains and would not give it away for nothing. I was not frightened, Inez said, though she was smiling. You were terrified, Hugh said, echoing her own words back to her from that first snowbound night on the trail. And you did it anyway, which is what brave means, when you look at it plainly. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, the one with the 2 missing fingers, scarred now but still warm, still steady, and held it a long moment while the wind moved through the pines and the creek ran on below them, carrying its water as it always had and always would, down through the whole green length of the valley they had saved together. I would do it again, Inez said. Every mile of it. The stair, the snow, Crane's men in the trees, all of it, if it meant arriving at the end of the trail with you. You will never have to do it again, Hugh said. I mean to spend the rest of my life making certain of that, but I am glad all the same that you would. They rode home together as the sun went down behind the western ridge, back down through the timber toward the ranch house where their 3 children waited, back down toward the valley that had once nearly been lost to a rich man's greed, and had instead become, through the courage of one trapper's orphaned daughter and the steady devotion of the man who had ridden beside her, the most secure and beloved stretch of country for 100 miles in any direction. A valley where the water ran free and the people who depended on it slept easy, knowing that whatever storms might come, whatever men with money and ambition might look with hunger on their creek, the ground beneath their feet was, at last and for good, entirely their own. And in the years that followed, whenever a new family arrived in Sweetwater Crossing looking for land to settle, someone in town, Mrs. Whitfield most often, though the story had by then passed into every mouth in the valley, would tell them how the whole place had very nearly been lost, and how it had been saved instead by a bargain struck between a lonely trapper's daughter and a steady young rancher. A bargain that had asked for nothing more than a fair claim to a small cabin and a place among the very people who had once looked at her sideways, and had given in return everything: a valley, a family, and a love that had outlasted every winter since. Inez Rourke lived to see her children grow, and her grandchildren after them, and the ranch at the head of Sweetwater Creek passed, in time, into the capable hands of her eldest son Liam, who kept the old cabin standing at the headwaters just as his mother had, a monument to a French-Canadian woman's songs and an Irish trapper's steady hands, and a daughter who had proven, on one desperate mountain crossing, that a person need not be born with wealth, or standing to be the one who saves everything that matters. And on quiet evenings, long after the story of Crane and the water rights had passed from memory into legend, the old folks of the valley would still say, if you asked them, that you could hear, on the wind that came down off the Bitterroot in autumn, the faint echo of a lullaby in French, carried down from the headwaters, where the creek that fed the whole green valley still ran clear and cold and entirely forever its own.